Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Fired Up. My name is Morgan McLintic, and I'm joined today by Nicole Pytel.
Hey, Morgan. Hey, everybody.
And Ian Lipner.
Hey, Morgan. Hey, everybody.
And today we're going to be talking all about podcasting. But before we get into that, it's a great day. Just a quick humble brag. We have just won the gold winner for Best B2B PR Campaign from the Drum Awards. So the Drum Awards, they give awards out for advertising, PR, a whole range of marketing. It's a legit award. And in the PR category for B2B, we are the winners for our campaign with our wonderful client, Perceptics. So quick shout out to all of our clients at Perceptics and the team working on that. Tough one to win. We're very proud. So thank you for the indulgence, indulging me a little bit on being proud about that. And actually, funnily enough, none of the people on this podcast were involved in that.
None of us are award winning.
We're all warming our hands on the award for other people's work, but congrats anyway. We're very proud of them. So let's dive into talk about podcasting. We just had the elections, and by some token, people are describing it as the first sort of podcast election. We know that podcasts were a very important way of the candidates reaching their audiences this cycle. So we thought, hey, let's just take a step back and look at what is going on in podcasting. It feels like many B2B brands have a podcast. There's lots of them being launched all the time. But what is the status and what are our recommendations when it comes to podcasting? So to kick us off then, Nicole, why don't you just give us the sort of top line about the state of podcasting as we close out 2024?
Right now, there are over 540 million podcast listeners worldwide. We found that almost half, 47% of Americans who are age 12 and older, listen to podcasts monthly. That is the highest that it has ever been. And 70% of people who listen every week, they consume podcasts on their mobile devices. I know I listen to things on my run or while I'm walking around the block. So it really gives us a new way to think about how we format content, how we distribute content. And with such massive, massive numbers, Morgan, this is something that can't be ignored anymore. I think some companies think, oh, it's a lot of work. It's an investment. What am I going to get out of it? The audience is there. You just have to be able to know how to reach them, I think.
Yeah, that's right. The audience is getting increasingly young. Millennials are the largest portion of people listening to podcasts today, but that's going to be overtaken by Gen Z by about 2027, according to some of the reports. So if you're a brand that needs to target a slightly younger demographic, or you want to build your brand with those Gen Z audiences, this is a great channel for them. But once that audience have heard about you, what do they do? And there's some great stats here from eMarketer. I'm just going to say that once the Gen Z audience have heard of them, 61% of them then go to the brand's website. Same number want the service. So getting name recognition on a podcast, you might think, look, people are busy doing something else, right? We're listening to podcasts. I'm busy driving, I'm busy doing chores, I'm doing my exercises, but people do listen and then later on take action. And so this isn't just for thought leadership, this is also for conversion. We'll go on and talk about goals, but this is a serious channel for B2B brands.
You don't have as many opportunities for B2B brands normally to humanize your brand, right? And get people attached to it, right? And showcase the personalities that drive your company. You can do that at the same time. You're sort of creating a community, the repeat listeners, around very specific topics. That can be really powerful because those audiences are going to be very engaged because they know your stuff. It's a specific thing they want. They're experiencing content fatigue with other forms like blogs and white papers. They just want a person talking to them more, I think. And I think that's what we're doing here.
I think the humanizing part is a big, big deal because I think you have this rise of podcasting that comes at the same time, coincidentally or not, with the rise of AI, and I was talking to somebody the other day, are we going to start stamping 100% grade A human created on our content like we stamp on like a package of organic beef? Are we going to get to that in the AI revolution? So I think, in this whole era of AI, people crave authenticity, and a podcast is a really good way to do that. Like, to Ian's point, it humanizes your brand. We market ourselves all the time. We've got our blog, we've got our newsletter, we've got all of our things, but I think people really get to know us as human beings here on Fired Up. For better or for worse, maybe they get to see our personalities come out, but it's a great chance because, I always say B2B buyers, they're humans too. And so, you have to connect with them on that level. So I think any opportunity you have to humanize your brand is a very good thing.
Podcasting had a real heyday during the pandemic, and you saw a number of brands, Spotify bought Gimlet, etc., during that sort of move in to try and double down on it. Since the pandemic, it dropped dead. We had a little sort of podcasting bubble around that time, but listenership has steadily increased and will continue to increase. Funnily enough, sort of return to the office, I feel, has put some more momentum behind podcast listening, because now you've got a commute, you're sitting on public transit, you're in your car or whatever. Again, it's a great way to reach your audiences. So it's had a little bit of resurgence. As we've seen with the election, we're going to see this continue. Why do we think that it works for B2B audiences, Ian?
B2B audiences are generally talking about complex topics that don't translate as well into shorter formats. For a lot of folks, they don't want just the article on what is this. They want that next step, how to do it, when to do it. They give B2B companies an opportunity to, like we were talking about, layer in that authentic voice and educate the market, like a willing audience that's there to be educated. 74% of podcast listeners are tuning in because they're knowledge seeking. They want to learn new things. They're not just tuning in to hear a celebrity be famous, right? They actually want information. And that really aligns well with what B2B folks, their own behavior is, that information seeking, get me to the people who know what they're talking about. And a lot of those folks, they may be more senior. They may not be in the trenches and want to go down and say, hey, so how does this AI thing work in comms? Or ask those technical questions. A lot of times, these are the folks who are sort of have established careers. 45% of podcast listeners have an annual household income of $250,000 or more. That could be a couple that's well into their careers. That's a valuable audience that, let alone on the B2C side, those are the folks who are making a lot of the decisions in the trenches. And they have the folks who know technically what the problems are, but they also want to hear it from other voices that are senior, that used to be in the trenches and now are kind of like, hey, I want to find out what is the best way for me to make this decision, to approach this problem. And I want the whole answer. I don't want the categorical answer. And then I got to go educate myself someplace else about that discipline or technique. The medium also is sort of flexible, right? So I can pause, right? And come back to it when I jump back in my car, right? It's like a passive learning process. When I jump in my car, my phone plays exactly where I was on Spotify before, right? And, oh yeah, I was learning about this. Let's go ahead, hit me with this. So I think it actually sort of retargets itself without, you know what I mean? Like, it has that mechanism in it. So, I mean, overall, it's hard to build community. It's hard to find people who are serious about the topic and aren't just sort of browsing and trying to shallowly educate themselves. And it's hard to find the decision makers. And I think they're listening to podcasts.
All right. We've established, look, this is a medium that reaches high value targets, increasingly a younger audience. I'm a marketer, a startup. What should I do about this from a content perspective? And I want to talk about from an advertising perspective as well. But let's start with content.
To approach podcasting, you need to approach it the same way that you would approach the funnel. To Ian's point, people want to learn. We know that B2B buyers are consuming many, many pieces of content. Some studies say as much as 13 pieces of content before they're making a decision. A few podcast episodes is a great way to learn something, to get to know the people behind it. And Ian also made a point about credibility. There's something to be said for getting to hear somebody, getting to see them, seeing their mannerisms, as opposed to maybe just reading something that they've written. You almost get like this face-to-face feel with them, which can really get B2B buyers over the hump. But in terms of a content strategy, I think you need to think of it in terms of the funnel. You need to think of that thought leadership right at the top, bringing people in, purely serving them with helpful information. I think then you can move into the middle of the funnel. Bring on some of your clients, bring on some of the people that you know, have almost a podcast case study, so to speak. Go behind the scenes of some of the strategies that you've done or some of the impacts that you've made. And then, of course, you can hit the bottom of the funnel too, where you talk about, maybe how your product relates to what's going on in the news right now, or if there's something you can newsjack to make it relevant. Nobody wants to listen to a podcast just about your product or your solution. But I think you need to think in terms of the entire funnel. And I think you can also think in terms of repurposing. We're always saying to clients, you don't just do an ebook. You don't just do a blog post. It needs to be part of something bigger. And a lot of times you can get podcast episodes from content that you're creating for other channels. Maybe you wrote a blog post and you want to dig deeper into it, or you want to interview an expert about it and, go a little bit more in depth. You can do all of that with podcasting. You just have to be strategic about it, especially at the startup marketer level where there's never enough time. There's never enough resources. You're stretched really thin. Think about it like you would the rest of your content strategy, and it will start to kind of unveil itself.
Right. I do think that it often comes up, hey, should we start a podcast? Where does that fit in the types of content that you produce? Because this is a higher lift type of content. You need a champion who can kind of drive it. You need some production. It needs some assistance. It's more than ripping out a blog post. We often talk to companies, and then once they understand fully what's involved, they'll think, oh, okay, I've got some other steps up the sort of content ladder to take before I put this in there. But once you're there, then as you say, Nicole, it can drive a lot of derivative content. So, you might record a podcast and it'll normally have some shorts from that you can share on YouTube Shorts or TikTok. It can have a companion blog post. There's normally a blog post sort of to house the podcast itself, which can be search optimized. You can get the transcripts, and you could maybe use those transcripts again for extra content. And once you've got some episodes in the can, you can then perhaps chop them up and sort of pull out some key themes across the last year of episodes as well. So it's definitely a lift. But once you have this going, then I do think it can have a lot of downstream derivative content. And we see from our metrics, for example, on our website, it drives up the dwell time, because we'll just listen to it right there on the page, right? So that sends good signals to Google that your website overall has interesting content. And because this is a long form format, it'll increase the time on page as well. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, if you decide to have this type of content.
And one of those benefits is the data, because this gives you yet another chance to see what topics are resonating? Which one did people gravitate towards? If somebody gravitated towards a particular episode, what did you talk about, or what was the format? And so that'll help inform what you do next on your podcast, or maybe what you do next in your entire content strategy. If you do, say a series on ABM, for example, and people eat it up, do more of that. It works. So it is another piece of data that you can rely on to kind of put that puzzle together of what your content strategy actually looks like.
And you need to think about the format a little bit. There are perhaps two types of podcasts. There's ones which cover the sort of topical news of the day. So here are our takes about what's happening in our industry. And the great thing about that is people will keep coming back to listen to that, because they like your take and they want to use the time that they're driving to kind of get updated on the news and to sort of hear commentators' opinions about what's happening. So if you are in an industry where there's a lot of things going on and you're the kind of company that has those interesting takes, this could be a great format for you. You can drive a lot of engagement with that because people will agree with you or maybe they won't. The other type is a more sort of evergreen educational type of podcast. We do this, we see a lot of interviews. You dive deep into a topic that your audience should be interested in. And the idea is, this is good. And maybe your people will come in and listen to this, and then they'll find other episodes in your back catalog that they're also interested in and educate themselves. And they might sort of cherry pick the ones that they want, but those episodes will live out there and be indexable and findable by others later on. So they have a longer shelf life, but perhaps less urgency to listen to on the day compared to the more newsier format. So as you're sort of thinking about that, I really think that depends on the type of company that you are, your brand archetype. If you like to be controversial and you're the outlaw, then you can be that kind of brand. We think of ourselves as a sage, right, that helps educate other people to do what they need to do. A longer form, evergreen style is better for us. Another trend here is that video podcasts are taking off. Why do you think that is, Ian?
You're putting a face to a brand. You're seeing what are they really like. I mean, as much as I detest being watched, when you're watching a video podcast, you can see people's conviction about what they're saying. And you can kind of tell if they're just sort of, what I don't like about a lot of podcasts is that people will just always agree with each other. Yes. And then they'll summarize what the other person says, right? So in a video podcast, you can kind of see, hey, how much are they interested in what their fellow podcaster has to say? Are they buying it? It helps you get an understanding of like, hey, is this a consensus? Is this one person's opinion? That kind of thing. I mean, we haven't done it, but I have seen a lot of video podcasts where they're adding special effects now. They're doing cool little graphics that will come in during a specific segment that they repeat, or they'll use it like right now. If we were a little fancier, maybe we'd be putting up cool graphs with these stats. But again, you got to do the amount of production that makes sense for your audience and that makes sense for the ability to continue to produce new content, right? Like it's more important that you continue to create new reasons for people to come to your podcast with cool guests and good topics than anything else. So in general, I think that the future is going to, with AI tools, is going to make it so that Morgan presses a soundboard type button and a light bulb pops up when he thinks that somebody's saying a good idea. Like these tools are going to come on. Like even the production side, like I'm looking at notes, I'm looking down a little bit, I'm trying to find who to watch. I think we're going to get better interfaces so that we can maintain better eye contact, and teleprompter type capabilities will arrive. But until then, interact the best way you can. And we're all used to doing video calls. And so this feels a lot like business, I think.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the tools like Descript has now, which is a common sort of post-production video editing for podcasts mainly tool, has an AI feature where you can make your eyes look at the camera. So if you're looking away and, you're thinking, often people, if they're visual thinkers, they'll look up when they're thinking. It will move your pupils down so that you look like you're looking in the camera. I mean, it's a bit sort of, I'm looking like this in the camera, and a bit sort of strange, but it definitely makes that easier. And if you misspeak, it can record your voice and sub in. You can type in the word you meant to say, and it will overlay that with your voice. So the reason I mentioned that is it's getting better already. There are tools like Opus as well. Almost all the snippets that you see about video podcasts are produced by a tool called Opus AI. It goes through and produces the clip, and you can drop in stock photos, AI generated imagery straight in that tool into the clips or into your whole overall podcast. So the production is getting easier, and I think the production values are getting better, but the direction of podcasts is towards video. YouTube is the number one channel for people listening to podcasts today here in 2024. So that might surprise some. They might think it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's YouTube. 33% of people prefer a video podcast, and they'll maybe just have it running in the background so you can just listen to the audio. Or if it's more visual and they're slapping up graphs, you can actually join on and watch it. It does increase the production values or expectation there. But video is where this medium is going. And what's great about that is it improves discovery for your podcast, because what else is YouTube? It's the number 2 search engine. So people can find topics and discover your podcast, whereas the audio one, you have to find them on social, or a friend has to say, hey, I heard of this great podcast, or, you gradually invite the guests and they use that when they promote it, their audiences, and it sort of gradually grows like that. YouTube can accelerate that through greater discovery. And that sort of probably legislates towards the evergreen type of podcast that we were talking about earlier, because then your sort of back catalog has a bit more life compared to, hey, let's talk about the tech analysis from 3 months ago.
And I think that big focus on YouTube, I don't want that to scare our startup marketing friends who maybe haven't started yet. And I think Ian made a good point about start at your own level. Nobody expects you to come out with fancy graphics and perfect production and perfect lighting and all of these things right out of the box. And if you're trying to hold yourself to that standard, you'll never start. We've gotten a lot better at this than when we started. I'm sure if you go back and listen to some of our old episodes, I'm sure we're talking over each other and sounding a bit ridiculous in moments, but you can't let perfect be the enemy of good in this situation. Like, yes, you're going to be on YouTube. Yes, there's going to be people staring at you, but just go and do it and talk about the things that you're comfortable talking about and gradually increase that production value. Don't put all that pressure on yourself right out of the box.
So, Nicole, on this, let's talk about podcasting's role in the sales funnel. We talked about where it fits in our sort of content strategy. Brands want it for thought leadership, but where does it sort of fit in the funnel?
Yeah, it kind of fits all throughout. It's good for brand awareness. It's good for lead nurturing. If somebody's an active opportunity, they're going to probably go check out your podcast and see what else you have to say. And like we talked about with the data, there's so many ways to measure that impact on your sales funnel. You're going to get listener analytics. You're going to get lead gen metrics. You're going to get things like that. And I think the real focus in the sales funnel is on thought leadership. We did some digging. We saw that businesses who are doing B2B podcasts, they're saying about 40% of them say that thought leadership is their primary goal, which is great. The more information you can share, the better. And that could be a really good way to accelerate your sales funnel. Because, we're always asking sales folks, what are the questions that you're getting? What objections do you need to combat? And if you can address some of those things on your podcast, that's a lot of prospect education that your sales team doesn't need to do. So it really can actually shorten the sales cycle if sales is getting more educated, more qualified, more prepared leads, just thanks to a podcast that you did once, instead of sales who has to have, a million different conversations with a million different prospects. I think it can play a huge role in the sales funnel in more ways than people think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we talked a little bit about account-based marketing, and you just talked about addressing objections during the sales process. I mean, it's not out of the realm that you could be in the middle of a pitch with a big company and you didn't have a chance to, in your pitch, your in-person pitch, show them all the things you can do. Or maybe you think that there's a specific issue that's going to be the key thing, and you said that in your pitch, and now you want to bring in experts that really open that up and get into those things. It's an opportunity to show who you know. You bring in folks that are expert. It has a halo effect upon your brand. And obviously, all the people that follow them and are interested in what they have to say are going to be introduced to you. I used to be on a podcast where we talked about crisis and we talked about data issues. And when we were able to bring folks like Brian Krebs onto the podcast, all of a sudden it was like, okay, this isn't just folks tooling around with Zoom over there. This is a serious discussion. And that enabled us to have some more opportunity in cybersecurity. Those ways to associate yourself with the folks who carry a lot of weight in your community at the right times can change this from something that's just, kind of thought leadership and hoping that it connects with people to a sales tool.
And just anecdotally, look, we often talk to people who are about to announce fundraising, and we've got content about that, including a podcast episode. So I'll often send that, or they're thinking about ABM, and we've done several episodes about ABM and the pros and cons and the readiness and what's involved. So we'll send those on and say, hey, look, if you're interested in it, we've explored this. And I think by association, that gives you credibility and it shows some depth of thinking that, hey, we understand the challenges that you face and we've solved some of them. So I think that creates a great connection. So we've been talking about creating your own podcast, which is a lift. But Ian, if you have a great spokesperson, you don't need to create your own. You can guest on other people's and tap into their audience. What do you think about pitching spokespeople to podcasts? And it sounds like a great strategy, but it's harder than you might think.
Folks are just like any other media or content generator. They're approached by a lot of folks who aren't fits. And that is one of the biggest things that we are always dealing with in media relations is just there's a lot of folks who are muddying the water when you've got the right thing. You've got the thing. And that journalist should be interested, or that podcast should be interested in that thing. But there's a lot of people kind of coming at them. I would also say you have to establish your credentials. You have to make a couple softball podcast appearances where, maybe they're not the most famous ones, but, give yourself some reps. It's your audio resume, basically, as you start pitching other podcasts. If you can say, hey, we were already on this podcast that journalist might have heard of, or that podcaster might have heard of, that's going to raise your profile in their eyes. And it might be even to a certain extent among podcasters, they might be more familiar with other podcasters than they are brands, right? And so you've got to kind of climb up that ladder. Sometimes you have that thing, like I said, that's perfect, and it can help you jump a few rungs because of what's going on in the news or the difficulty of finding an expert like you, right? And that might carry you into a higher plane faster. But generally, it's reps. It's getting on a podcast, looking the part and making those mistakes and refining what you're bringing to the table. One thing people don't like is you bringing the same thing to every podcast. Like you do your spiel about the thing that it is that you do. You're not updating it. If they can listen to a different podcast and you're pitching the same thing that they're listening to, they're not going to be as interested. It's more about how can you tailor this to my listeners as a podcaster? How can you make sure that you're bringing something that we haven't done before? I'm not going to try to pitch the PR podcast on how to do media relations, right? But you might pitch them on how to do media relations after this election. So looking for those angles. And then in terms of the approach, not every podcaster is doing this for a living. It might not be the top priority for them, especially as you're climbing up those rungs. Like be patient, do follow up, right? See if they're interested. And as you pitch the bigger podcasts, list those, make it easy for them to go through your qualifications, your spokesperson's qualifications, and be bringing a topic that has an edge to it, has something that sounds provocative or sounds hard to get into without an expert like you.
So you don't need to create it. You can pitch into other podcasts, and some of them are going to be more professionally managed than others. You're going to work your way up, but just to build out your audio resume. I like that idea. The podcast hosts, they want great guests. They're relying on this episode to be good for their audience. They have a standard, and you need to show you can kind of meet that standard and sort of add to it. And they'll love having great new guests on because they need to fuel regular content for their channel. But Nicole, you can create your own podcast, and it can be a series. It doesn't have to be an ongoing thing. You can pitch other people's. You can also just advertise on podcasts as well. So what have we found there? What's the state of play?
As we might expect, knowing how many listeners are actually out there, podcast advertising revenue is huge. By 2026, it's expected to reach nearly 2.6 billion with a B dollars. And I think one of the reasons why is that podcasts serve very, very niche markets. So it gives advertisers a really highly targeted opportunity. I know our clients are always excited to run LinkedIn ads because they think that that's very granular targeting. Well, so are podcasts. If you're listening to us right now, for example, you're a startup marketer or you're a startup founder, you have something to do with the startup world. So if we were taking ads and you want to reach people at startups, this is the place to be. So you can get that granular on a different channel than maybe you think. So even this year alone, we're looking at over $2 billion that advertisers are going to spend. That's 15.9% more than last year. That's wild growth. I don't think any other ad platform can boast, almost 16% growth year over year. That's huge.
Yes, it's growing, but it's still really small when it comes to overall ad spend. I think overall ad spend this year is something like 396 billion. So podcasting represents 0.6% of ad spend in the US. So it's still tiny. And to me, that just spells huge opportunity. You've got a rising proportion of your target audience consuming this content, but lagging is the advertising spend to meet that. And that means that the rates are going to be cheaper and there's more opportunity for you to get in there. And these ads, 44% are read by the host, and just under that are read by another announcer. But if they're read by the host, it really sounds like part of the content. You're getting the trust that that host has built up with their audience, and it's being conferred onto your brand. So that works really well. That's how early we are in podcast advertising. These ads are handcrafted by the host of the program. I would expect over the next few years, as ad spend increases in this area, more of it will be created by other announcers or creative agencies. More of it will be bought by programmatic, which means by an algorithm rather than sort of hand targeted. 9% is programmatic at the moment. If it's going to scale, that just has to change. So as a listener, expect more sort of standardized advertising to come. But as a brand, you can really start to reach audiences that you hadn't really thought about and sort of spend at scale. This as an advertising thing is still kind of small for some of the big brands because you have to sort of hand do it. But we're really going to see a change in that over the next few years. So for brands that want to get in there early, now's the time.
Yeah, I'm writing that insight down with my papermate SharpWriter number 2 right now.
Well, you've got to keep up with the latest trends there, Ian, and I've got an electric pencil sharpener to sell you. 42% of these ads, according to the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the IAB, are to build brand. So just to get your name out there. 39% are for direct response. And we just talked about how Gen Z audiences do take action when they hear a podcast advert, and the rest is to promote some content. So it's a nice blend of brand awareness and conversion in terms of goals for podcast ads at the moment. We don't see a lot of our clients talking about this right now, but I'm going to bet that in 2025, this really comes onto the radar. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's coming up over the next year. What trends do we see, Nicole?
We've already touched on a couple. What's next? There's going to always be advancements in technology. We know AI is going to come in and play a role. And also, you could look at automated content curation. I wouldn't do it, but it's out there. To the other end of the spectrum, personalized podcast experiences. Just like you're personalizing your marketing efforts, your podcast experience can be personalized too. So there's a lot coming. And I think that's why it's so important to get a jump on it now before it becomes a big thing that everybody's doing. Get in now while, it's still relatively untapped, either from a production or an advertising standpoint. And then you'll be right there on the ground floor as these advancements start to roll out, and you could be one of the first to take advantage of them.
I always like talking about, okay, what's next? Morgan was talking about what's already here because he's always got his hands on these tools, but interactive podcasting platforms are going to be growing. Like there's going to be more live interactions. I think there'll be ways to more directly engage with hosts or access more resources more quickly. I can imagine folks doing interactive projects through their podcasts. We cite a stat, 60% of marketers are saying that it's going to be more important to their overall strategy. So they're going to try new things. You can't just do everything that's already been done. You gotta test these new things. I think, like we talked about, ads are going to get better, like down to like individual keywords as we're talking, to the extent that we get more data for those who are the podcasters to make better decisions, to understand the effect of all the sort of different formats that they're creating from the same podcast, rolling that all up and being able to say, yeah, the TikTok reels got me this, each channel got me this from my podcast. So you could wad that all up a little bit better and present that value to those who are wondering about it. I love it that right now it's the smaller companies that are doing this. It's keeping it authentic, right?
Yeah.
Like I would much rather listen to something done by the sort of that SMB mid-market myself than the sort of overproduced kind of like, a very large IBM-like company breaking it down for me from their perspective. So there's a lot of runway for more people to join in and for the new tech to make it more engaging still.
We're seeing a trend of more people are listening to this, even though there are thousands of B2B podcasts out there already. It's still early days. The production is getting easier to do, even with video. So there's a lot of opportunity, even if you haven't started your podcast or started pitching other podcasts or started advertising on podcasts, there's a lot of opportunity here. One thing that I'm interested to do, and I'd love to see this next year, is some custom like mini series, maybe 4-episode sort of CTA like guide that you could produce. So on your podcast or on a podcast you go on or in your ad, it's an audio format. Can you create an audio conversion event? That would be great. Just 4 episodes of 10 minutes talking about an issue that then drives into some other action that the person could take, because people are listening to they're in audio mode. So have your conversion event be audio. I don't see that happening a lot at the moment. It could be a huge opportunity. So there's lots of ways to sort of explore this medium in a B2B startup context that won't cost a lot, but could drive a lot of conversion and reflect really well on your brand. Okay, Nicole, Ian, thanks so much for your time today. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think we're up on podcasts. It's exciting. And even though it's an established medium, it's one that's still on the rise and will be for a number of years. So it's a great bet to place. And thank you all for listening and for watching. We really appreciate it. It's great to see you. And we will talk to you again next week.